See you later, suckers. I'm out of here. Shit. Welcome to a really bad review of One Piece World Seeker. Gonna jump straight into the story here. It's an original story with the original cast from the One Piece series with a couple of new additions. It isn't good. Now, wait. I know a lot of die-hard fans will probably disagree with me here, but hear me out. Unpopular opinion, I know, but just because the anime and manga are good, it doesn't mean that anything based on the franchise also has to be good. For example, I love Dragon Ball, but the story here wasn't good. Oh, by the way. At the beginning of the game, you see Luffy fall from the sky prison after an attempted rescue by his pirate buddies. I'd like to tell you more about the situation, but there isn't anything to tell. There's no context as to how you ended up there, except for the fact that you've been captured. That's it. Then a brief cutscene sees the aforementioned escape from the prison, which clearly has some glaring security flaws. You are rescued from the sea by a passerby named Jean. Let's just call her Jay. Pay attention, she's important. And that's that. Welcome to World Seeker. In some ways I'm actually quite happy about this. I can be fairly impatient when playing games, and there's nothing more frustrating to me than lengthy unwanted cutscenes, especially when I'm not even invested into the story yet. You spend the entire game roaming around the uninspired prison island. Seriously uninspired, but I'll get into that later. With Jay, who is the leader of the people but doesn't actually have much power to do anything, as the island is controlled by the Navy, and the leader of this particular squadron is Isaac. It's clear from the beginning that your ultimate goal is to take down Isaac, but to add a little extra narrative to the situation, you're also tasked with helping the people of Prison Island as they struggle with the internal conflict between Pro and Navy supporters, which I thought was a nice and interesting way to give you some perspective of the situation you've been dropped into. Don't get too excited about that bit of praise, by the way. Now, I know I said the story is bad, and let me explain why. It isn't actually bad. I know it sounds stupid, but just... The idea of the story isn't a bad one. If this was part of the anime series, it would have been told in a better way, in more depth, and covered more of what could have been offered, creating a saga, so to speak. But the way this story has been written into the game is boring and tragic. It's hugely disconnected, anyone outside the main cast is monotonous, generally unimpressive, and only voiced as far as a couple words or random anime sounds. And even the main cast barely have their part to play. They're involved in the story quite infrequently, and when they are involved they have little to no impact on what's actually happening and seem to have just been written into the story because they're part of the franchise. Every single character, with the exception of Luffy, Jay and Isaac, are just there to stall the progression of the story and make their cameo. I guess what I'm trying to say is, the story had potential but was ruined by the fact that it was in a game and not told properly. The gameplay itself broke up the story and disenchanted me as a player, caused me to try and rush the gameplay just to keep interest in what was actually happening, and unfortunately, a good idea for a story can be a bad story if it isn't told properly, and that's what's happened here. It's a bad story. Now, usually I'd go from here to talk about the voice acting, but there basically isn't any. 80% of the speech in the game is represented by subtitles. The voice acting is solid. Each character's part is reprised by their voice actor from the anime, so the very few times you hear more than a couple of words of speech, it's good. The rest of the time is spent reading or skipping through text so the developers could save as much money as possible on the voice actors. Now, normally I'd have some sort of segue between sections here, but... The gameplay! Naturally, it has its good and bad points, as does pretty much everything. So let's start out with talking about the combat and the systems that come with that. The combat itself has some fun aspects, but ultimately it's pretty repetitive. 90% of enemy encounters require little to no thought building up to them whatsoever. You can literally run in arm swinging and take down as many enemies as required. The combat can be a little robotic and awkward as well, whilst utilising the movement and aiming separately for what is essentially an RPG crossed with a beat 'em up. You'd think with all the FPS titles out there this mechanic would be nailed down by now, but it just doesn't feel suitable for the combat in World Seeker. It works well for projectile or long range moves, like, you know, when you do the fist thing, you punch and this one here. But considering you could just easily get by smashing the attack button, it all kind of feels a little pointless. Despite being on the repetitive side, the developers did work in some variety with regards to the combat, with the change in modes from observation to armament, but again, they don't ultimately change the outcome of how you really approach fights, with the exception of choosing to block or dodge. The upgrade system was simple to use and offers a respectable amount of upgrades relevant to the game's time frame, but fell short of what you would expect from an RPG. All stat upgrades came from items you can equip. Don't know about anyone else, but unless these items literally fell onto my lap by completing a mission I just happened to already have collected the items for, it was utterly pointless and served next to no purpose. I didn't struggle too much with anything in regards to physical attributes, and yet I don't think I gained a single item to equip after about 4 or 5 hours into the game. It just seemed like an absolute afterthought by the developers just to add a bit more depth in the game at the end of the development cycle. Generally the combat, the system and mechanics that come with it are borderline tedious, rushed and unpolished. Yeah, I feel like I've definitely experienced worse in games and this wasn't really even close to being unplayable. I still got some entertainment from it. Being an open world game, the approach the developers take to exploring and traversing the land is very important in order to stop things from going stale. Things went stale. The camera is fine, I suppose. It only really became a nuisance in a few areas of combat, so my complaints on that aspect are kind of minimal, but actually getting around is a bit of a ball ache to say the least. Why did they do this? This is probably the best part of the game. It allowed free movement of the towns and landscapes with relative ease, and although it didn't have the same entertainment and variety of Spider-Man for example, it was certainly one of the game's better points. So then why did the developers decide that less than halfway through the game they would station 1,000 troops on the roofs of every town and give them pinpoint accuracy with their guns to simply shoot you out the sky? This has to be one of the most ridiculous decisions in gaming I've ever seen. You've taken something fun and almost unique and then taken a huge dump all over it. I could make my peace with getting shot out the sky if you were presented with an option to avoid it, but you aren't. As Buzz Lightyear once said, "This isn't flying, this is falling with style." Except there is no style and you just hit the ground like a ton of bricks after having your health bar molested. The whole game feels like it had big dreams and ideas but was ultimately rushed or developed on a small budget, and all those dreams had to be removed or stretched across as much of the game as possible. In terms of story and gameplay, One Piece World Seeker is a slice of white bread with a thin layer of butter being eaten by gamers with a rich taste for food. It might briefly satisfy your appetite, but in a pretty bland and unappealing way. Speaking of unappealing, the graphics! The development team behind the game did a good job of capturing Luffy's character, and the models of the main cast were generally pleasing to the boob. But pleasing to the eye. The lighting effects were fairly understated but worked well within the game's environment, and that's it actually, that's it. Again, it's another case of the main cast are really the be all and end all of the game because the rest of it looks kind of like garbage. After reading through a lot of people's thoughts regarding the aesthetic of World Seeker, it seems that the general consensus was that it was pretty nice, but it really isn't. I get it. It's based on an anime, there's a style to uphold here, but some parts are inexcusable. The trees, branches and leaves are completely flat with no attempt to remove the papery look. The NPCs are uninspired. This is a word you're going to hear quite a few times, by the way. Look terrible and their line work is blurry. For a game you could play at 1440p, why make the lines blurry? The sense of repetitiveness is a strong theme in this game and it carries over to the graphics. I feel as if the flashy colours, lighting and vast Greenland areas have got people fooled into thinking it's a pretty game, but to me, it looks like a copy and paste job. The environments are bland, boring and unappealing and offer little to no incentive to explore them, and the towns are uninspired, again, and without the buildings are essentially empty in comparison to other similar RPGs. A perfect comparison here would be Zelda: A Breath of the Wild. This is how you make a cartoony style with vast Greenland areas look good. Bright and well lit environments are used where necessary, but the game has a variety and an obvious art direction. World Seeker looks like a game that was ruled with an iron fist when it came to protecting the image of the main characters, and then the rest was left to be made by Dave, who has a desk in the office next to the toilet. Good job, Dave, you almost had everyone fooled. Don't get me wrong, there's a few areas that do look nice, but when discussing the environments and NPCs, World Seeker just lacks any inspiration and hides behind vivid colours and lighting effects to mask the lack of imagination and style. The open world areas are boring and samey, and the towns are uninspired, again, with buildings mostly looking the same. Did anyone else feel like they were playing through a remaster of a last gen game? Because that's honestly what this felt and looked like to me. Anyway, let's just head for the summary. The story! 3 out of 10. A good idea, poorly executed and ruined by the gameplay. The gameplay! 3.5 out of 10. Some entertaining parts, but generally boring and spread very thin. The graphics! 3 out of 10. Not the worst for sure. The anime style was maintained, but the overall look was kind of outdated and, again, uninspired. The Straw Hat Effect! 5 out of 10. Luckily this game was based on a successful anime with a charming main character, otherwise sales would have been shocking. And overall it's a 3.5 out of 10. Sorry my fellow anime fans, but if you're an avid One Piece supporter, I wouldn't recommend picking this up unless it's on a huge sale. Thanks for watching guys, be sure to subscribe to keep up to date with new videos, and follow me on Twitter, I think. Thanks.